Goodbye grit, hello speed. It seems like a popular word throughout the Dean Evason tenure has been erased from the Minnesota Wild record books. We'll talk about John Hynes' continued push for speed and quickness, as well as some parallels that can be drawn from the Vancouver Canucks firing Bruce Boudreau and bringing in Rick Tocchet. All that and more on today's episode of Locked on Wild.
You're Locked on Wild, your daily podcast on the Minnesota Wild. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hey, this is Brandon Duhaime, and this is Locked on Wild.
What is happening, everybody? Welcome into another episode of Locked on Wild, your daily Minnesota Wild podcast, part of the Locked on Podcast Network, your team every day. Thank you, as always, for making Locked on Wild your first listen each and every day. Make sure you subscribe on YouTube and your favorite podcast platforms so you don't miss out on any new episodes throughout the week. Today's episode of Locked on Wild is brought to you by Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONNHL for $20 off your first purchase. On today's episode of Locked on Wild, we continue to take a look at what John Hynes will bring to the Minnesota Wild as head coach. We'll talk about moving away from grit and moving towards some speed and how that can help the Wild as they move forward. We'll also take a look at a coaching change that I think honestly has a lot more similarities than I even first thought, with the Vancouver Canucks moving on from Bruce Boudreau and bringing in Rick Tocchet. We'll talk about that to finish the show here today as well. My name is Seth Topal, your daily Minnesota Wild insider. Folks, the energy's back. My voice obviously still sounds like crap, but the energy's back. And I actually just finished listening to John Hynes' media availability after practice today, ahead of tomorrow's game against the Nashville Predators. And I'm going to just throw it right out there. I continue to be impressed by what I hear from him in these first couple of days since taking over for the Minnesota Wild, because it seems like he has a plan. It seems like he has a plan, and he has identified some areas that can be improved by this team to help them try to, at the very least, win some games and kind of get themselves back to playing like a team, something that we haven't seen a whole lot here to start this season. And I don't think it's any coincidence. We talked about this in the postcast last night. That postcast, by the way, was a blast. So if you haven't had a chance to tune into it, make sure you go back and listen. One of our biggest Locked on Wild postcasts of all time. And why not? After a nice, fun win by the Wild over the St. Louis Blues. And I talked about it then. I went back and looked, and I can fully verify that a key phrase that has been used quite often for the Minnesota Wild, I mean, they even put it on a rally towel for the postseason. A massive phrase in this team's history is missing. Grit, ladies and gentlemen, it appears may be gone, because the new word for John Hynes has been speed. He has used the word speed quite often so far in his tenure. And the notion of grit is a different way of trying to win by outmuscling, outwilling your opponent, and being able to do the things that speed players often don't like to do, such as winning puck battles along the boards, using your physicality to try to wear down and slow down faster opponents, and basically bowling balling your way to wins, because by the time the third period comes around, the notion is that your team that you're playing has no energy left in the tank to be able to push, to be able to continue to fight, that you have taken all of that from them, and then your time to pounce is often in the third period. Well, there's a problem with that notion. You have to be willing to do those things in order to win on grit. We haven't seen a lot of that this year. And so I think it is no small coincidence that John Hynes has come in and has tried to do something that he has done at his previous stops, the New Jersey Devils, the Nashville Predators, is he has tried to instill something that allows you to have more of a chance to come away with wins. Some of the things that Hynes talked about even today is the need to play not only with more speed and speed off the puck in particular, but quickness in movement with the puck and decision making as well. I think what we've seen from this team, especially this year, is that there is more of a drawn out decision-making process. And this has extended to the power play. This is extended to moving the puck up the ice. It just seems like there is a slower trigger pull on a lot of different things that happen with this team. Passes up the ice, passes around the perimeter on the power play. And I think that is one bad habit that John Hynes is trying to specifically eradicate here early on in his tenure with the Minnesota Wild. And he talked about it in his media availability today in saying that he wants to play a style that is more predicated on offense taking pressure off of defense, which I think is something that a lot of people, myself included, are very relieved to hear, because how many times have we seen this team just get stuck in the defensive zone, stuck defending until mistakes are made, and that leading to opponents scoring goals. We've seen it in probably single-digit games where the Wild have thoroughly held the advantage in terms of puck possession. And it's not going to be something that you win all the time, but Hynes is right on. He is dead right when he says that if you can play strong offense and defend away from your own net, a lot of times that takes the pressure off and requires that you defend less than when you're on your own end. And he's emphasizing getting the puck up the ice with quickness, with precision, with intent, and trying to, as quickly as you can, flip from defending to offense to continue to put pressure on the opponent and not get camped out on your own end. And so, yes, it is still a Minnesota Wild roster that does not have as much speed as other teams throughout the league do. But it's one thing to say we don't have as much speed as our opponents do, so we have to try to come up with a different way to do it. Then what Hynes has come in and said is we need to emphasize the speed that we have. And again, this stems to just getting a fresh set of eyes to come in and take a look at this thing and to try to instill some different areas that can help this team go from this kind of bull in a china shop, hunkered down in the defensive zone, to a team that can actually put some pressure on you offensively and can utilize the skill that they have and emphasize it, as opposed to trying to win in an entirely different way. So again, he has said all the right things since he took over. He has said a lot of things that sound really good, which is why I have been impressed by what we've seen from Hynes in his short tenure. Now, again, it's early on. This is still a roster that's got some question marks, but it seems like he has a plan for how to combat a lot of them. And so that, I think, is what makes this kind of exciting to have a new set of eyes that just has the ability to look at how these things have gone down in a little bit of a different way. Now, as for how that speed can be introduced, we'll talk about some of that, as well as making some parallels. Again, I was looking into it today, and there are way more parallels to the Vancouver Canucks situation than I think anybody realizes. So We'll talk about all that, but first we'll take a look at how the Wild can harness the speed that they have in John Hynes' new system. That's coming up after this here on Locked on Wild. Today's episode of Locked on Wild is brought to you by eBay Motors. Passion, drive, and patience. What brings home the winning trophy is also what keeps your ride or die alive. eBay Motors has everything you need to maintain your vehicle and level it up to peak performance. From superchargers, roof racks, exhaust kits, LED headlights, and more, whether you're into speed, power, or style, eBay Motors has got you covered. With over 122 million parts for your number one ride or die, you'll always find exactly what you're looking for. And with eBay Guaranteed Fit, your part is guaranteed to fit your ride every time or your money back. Because with eBay Guaranteed Motors, you're burning rubber, not cash. With all the parts you need at the prices you want, it's easy to turn your car into the MVP and bring home the win. Keep your ride or die alive at ebaymotors.com. Eligible items only, exclusions apply. eBay Guaranteed Fit only available to U.S. customers. Welcome back to today's episode of Locked on Wild. Once again, we thank you for making Locked on Wild your first listen each and every day. For the everydayers, make sure you tune in tomorrow as we will break down John Hynes' return to Nashville. We'll take a look at the surging Predators led by former Wild forward Andrew Brunette. Should be a fun matchup between these two teams because the Predators are playing their best hockey of the season. There's a lot to dive into for this one, so we will do that, and we'll talk about some of the players that can benefit from a new look from John Hynes as well. So we are getting to this idea of utilizing and harnessing speed. And yes, the Wild don't have as much as some of the other teams in the league do, but they certainly have some that I think has been underutilized so far this season. And we saw a big part of that in game one with a big bump in minutes for the fourth line. And at one point, even in the third period, the fourth line combination of Connor Dewar, Brandon Duhaime, and Vinny Lettieri was given a double shift, given more opportunities late in the game to just see what they have and to provide an element that just, I think, was overlooked by this team because you were playing four lines or trying to play four lines and roll four lines. But oftentimes it was 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4. Just this rigid, archaic structure of, well, our first line just played, so now we got to go with the second line. Now we got to go with the third line. And I'm telling you, I think if there's any one line that can benefit from getting some additional opportunity based on speed and work ethic, it's the line that has the speed and the work ethic. And it's no coincidence that that fourth line was arguably the best in the game against the St. Louis Blues, because when they're given an opportunity to utilize that speed and utilize their ability to create chances, the fourth line creates a ton of chances any given game. Given the opportunity to utilize that more, that is going to lead to goals. And so for John Hynes, one of the ways that he can introduce speed to this lineup is by giving the guys that have it more opportunities to do their thing to try to contribute to wins. Another way in which we have started to see the speed more influenced is in Kirill Kaprizov's game. Giving Kirill Kaprizov the opportunity to work the zone, back to working the zone, something that he has done at the height of his powers here in Minnesota. Giving him the opportunity to make plays with his legs is something that we saw from the first game of John Hynes as head coach against the Blues. And yes, you can't really give Kirill Kaprizov the opportunity to make plays with his legs if he doesn't look like he has strong legs. But it seems like over the last handful of games, we've seen a trend in the right direction for Kaprizov in terms of what he's able to do with the puck and without. And Hynes pinpointed an area that I think is a big area for improvement for this team in how they work without the puck. And if you are moving around and trying to create opportunities when you don't have the puck, that is what is going to lead to opportunities for this team to score. Too many times we've seen, especially on the power play, just hunker down and just stick in your spot. 5 guys just pillars out there, not moving, not working. And if you move around and generate some additional opportunities, that's going to help this team score some more goals. And that is something that is also going to just help take pressure off the defense and the goaltending. The other areas, maybe not in foot speed, but in decision making. We are going to see a trend towards quicker decisions, not as many of those Hail Mary attempts. I know the turnovers are still an issue. They still were an issue against the St. Louis Blues. But I think if John Hynes can introduce more of an intermediate type of passing approach where you are trying to go from A to D, but instead of going from A to D right away, A, B, C, and D are still available. Quick passes out of the zone, quick passes through the neutral zone. Just get everybody moving. Movements, even if you are a player that doesn't have speed, is where speed comes from. You have to move. You have to push. And these, I think, all are things that a new voice who is going to demand more. I was listening to an interview on the Daily Faceoff with one of Hynes' former players from back in New Jersey. Hynes is a coach that is going to demand a lot. He has expectations that he is going to demand are met, and has ways in which he rewards those that get there, and he has ways that he holds those accountable that don't. And so, again, I don't think seeing the fourth line get a 4-minute bump is the last time we're going to see that happen. Because what do you think John Hynes was doing while he wasn't coaching? He, I mean, obviously was taking time away from the game, but much like Rick Tocchet, who we'll talk about here in a second, these guys study the game. They look at what wins in this current NHL. And you look at a ton of the teams throughout the course of the league, and a lot of them have that same word that we have talked about quite a bit since the John Hynes tenure took over, is speed. It's not grit. It's not the thing they put on the rally towels for the postseason last year. That's not how it gets done. So it's not only in foot speed, but it's also in decision making and how you plan to attack an opponent. All of those things can help improve your speed to allow you to play quicker against your opponents. Now, I mentioned Rick Tocchet because honestly, I think there are a ton of parallels that can be drawn from when the Vancouver Canucks decided to replace Bruce Boudreau with Rick Tocchet. And so we'll take a look at some of those parallels and where Vancouver's at now after the coaching change when we continue today's episode of Locked on Wild after this. Today's episode of Locked on Wild is brought to you by Game Time. And if you, like me, enjoy living in the moment, then you have no doubt gone through the ticket buying experience the day of your favorite team playing their rival, or your favorite concert, or a comedy show after a nice dinner. And you probably have encountered tickets that are either too expensive, or you go to the event and you find out that they're obstructed. Game Time is here to erase all of those stresses of buying tickets the day of and make your ticket buying experience as enjoyable as possible. Game Time offers you last-minute deals plus the views from every seat in the venue. No longer going to have to deal with obstruction. You can find the best seats in the house at the best price. Download Game Time today, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONNHL for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Again, create an account and redeem code LOCKEDONNHL for $20 off. Download Game Time today. Last minute tickets, lowest price, guaranteed. Final segment of today's episode of Locked On Wild. Once again, we thank you for making Locked On Wild your first listen each and every day. You may have noticed that we have switched back to live premieres. That is not by accident, because Locked On has created the first ever national sports 24/7 streaming channel on YouTube. Locked On Sports Today is here for you 24/7, covering the top sports stories of the day with local experts of Locked On, plus our national shows covering every league. Go to Locked On Sports Today on YouTube and subscribe to the first ever national sports 24/7 streaming channel. Locked On Sports Minnesota has you covered as well. So head to the Locked On Sports Minnesota YouTube channel so that you can find 24/7 coverage of your favorite Minnesota sports teams there as well. Anybody think that the Vancouver Canucks situation with Bruce Boudreau and Rick Tocchet mirrors a little bit what just happened in Minnesota? Let's go back to when this initially was brought about. The Vancouver Canucks were floundering. They were in need of a head coach to help get them back into the postseason. They just ended up missing in 2021-2022. They brought Bruce Boudreau in after he was let go by the Minnesota Wild in 2019-2020. He came in 2021-2022, and Vancouver went 32-15-10 down the stretch. But as mentioned, they missed out on the postseason. It was a roster at the time that had a lot of veteran players and had a lot of players that were locked in, and not a ton that could be done from a flexibility standpoint to try to get things fixed. And so last year, they stumble out of the gate, and Bruce Boudreau is kind of hung out to dry. He walked the plank and coached a few games while the upper management levels found their guy, got their guy installed as the head coach. And so Boudreau ends up 18-25-3 in 46 games last season before he was let go and paid the price for roster construction. A Vancouver team that has a top-level player in Elias Pettersson, had at the time a disgruntled veteran in JT Miller, a roster that has Brock Besser, a roster that has several talented players, and just was not playing up to the standard that I think everybody expected that they would be with that team. And it seemed as though the roster just had kind of lost the message that Bruce was bringing to the table. And so they bring in Rick Tocchet, and at the time, the reaction to that was, oh, great, Jim Rutherford just brought in one of his guys to get this gig, and it's not really going to change anything because it's still a roster that has some major questions. We don't know if JT Miller is a long-term fit there. Elias Pettersson's just going to leave after his current deal is done. He doesn't want to sit through this mess. Does that sound familiar? Because in the span of 2 days, all of these things that we've seen that were called out at the time that Dean Evason was let go are the same sorts of things that were being said in Vancouver. And I know there are differences, but I find it interesting that a similar type thing happened. And what has Rick Tocchet done since? The Canucks finished 20-12-4 in the 36 games that he coached down the stretch. Still missed the postseason, but what has Vancouver done so far this year? They're 15-7-1. They are second in the Pacific Division. And if we'll recall some of the things that led to problems for Vancouver, which led to Bruce Boudreau being fired, was goaltending in particular was not great. Thatcher Demko in particular had a very rough start to the season. But you look at what happened after Rick Tocchet was brought in, and Demko finished the final few months of the season. He was 10-4 and 2 in the final 2 months of the season after Rick Tocchet took over. Had a goals against average right around 2, a save percentage that was very, very good, and a couple of shutouts as well. And I think the reason that it worked is because Rick Tocchet, obviously somebody that's been around the NHL quite a bit, he had a different set of expectations for what was required to win games than what Bruce Boudreau had. And so he comes in, he demands more, and it seems that it has been a good fit for Vancouver with Rick Tocchet as their head coach. Again, that's the Vancouver situation. That's not a one-size-fits-all for teams that fire coaches during the season, but it is the most recent example that we have of it. And that situation has improved substantially to the point that I think from a Vancouver perspective, you got to be pretty amped up about the potential for Elias Pettersson to re-up and to stay, which is a huge part of that team's success going forward. But it's not only the goaltending. You look at some of the other players from that 2022-2023 team that ended up finishing the year with incredibly strong numbers. Pettersson finished with 102 points. JT Miller had 32 goals. Andrei Kuzmenko came from nowhere and had 39 goals. Bo Horvat had 31 goals before he was traded. So there were a lot of players that stepped up. And even though that Vancouver team missed the playoffs that year, they built off of it and have come back stronger this season because their head coach has brought a new way of doing things that has been a voice that they have all obviously heard quite well since he was brought to Vancouver. And so that's the hope for the Minnesota Wild, is that John Hynes comes in with a new set of ideas, with a new set of expectations, and a new way of holding players accountable if they don't live up to what is expected and what is needed to win games at the National Hockey League level. Hynes and Tocchet, both guys that have been around the NHL quite a bit. And so it is a situation where you come in knowing what is expected to win games at the NHL level, and you have ideas about how it can be done your way. If the team responds, you start winning games. Now, again, it is one game, and it could go any number of ways. The Wild could lose 9 in a row. The Wild could win 9 in a row. The Wild could lose 2, win 2, lose 2, win 2. But it's a different set of expectations now and a different way of looking at how this team needs to win games. And I think the fact that we've taken such a key phrase from the Dean Evason tenure and just completely erased it, completely wiped the notion of grit from the vocabulary, and have gone to something that we see a lot in the NHL in the notion of speed. I think the fact that we've seen that already is an encouraging thing about how this is going to go. That is going to do it for today's episode of Locked on Wild. Once again, we thank you for tuning in and making Locked on Wild your first listen each and every day. And we thank you for all of those who have mentioned that Locked on Wild is either at the top of your list or in your top 5 for podcasts on Spotify Wrapped. I get a huge smile out of seeing all those. So if you haven't already, make sure to let us know that Locked On Wild's in your major listens for the year, because this is why we do it. We do it for all the fans, to keep you informed and to keep you entertained, whether the team wins or loses. We'll see what they can do tomorrow against the Nashville Predators. We'll have a preview for you coming up tomorrow as well. So make sure you stay tuned, make sure you subscribe, and make sure that you follow along so you don't miss out on any new content or news and notes here at Locked On Wild. You can find new episodes every Monday through Friday as part of the Locked On Podcast Network.